Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. We have Dr. O'Leary, Catina with us. She is, as if you've got the first two parts of this podcast, she's just plain amazing. But what we're going to do is we're going to tap into her amazingness, ask her some really interesting questions.
This is the Darshan Talks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.
We started off with talking about health literacy. The second podcast was about ways to increase health literacy, and she gave a couple of examples. And we were talking primarily around quote unquote health. And what I wanted to do was sort of pivot a little bit and start talking about health literacy in the context of the life sciences. And everyone talks about transparency and health literacy, especially around clinical trials. My first basic question is that the only place life sciences companies need to be engaging in health literacy?
Absolutely not. I'm a health literacy fanatic. So I think that health literacy applies in every part of your business. The fact of the matter is every business has employees who are actively engaged in their own health. And if you don't have health literate practices as in sort of your basic core business structure, you're not doing as much as you can toward health and wellness for the people who work for you. Healthier people, people who feel more confident in their health and their decision making around their health are much more able to show up and be productive at work and make good decisions and participate. So that's, baseline.
So employ themselves is what you're saying, if I
Absolutely.
Summarize.
So that's piece one. All of these companies should do that. But when their employees are in that space, then everything they create for their consumers, the customers, is also more health literate and accessible. So you start to think about sort of cycles of creating materials and resources and opportunities and trials that actually work better for the people who are engaged in them. And when you do that, you start to get to trials that people are engaged throughout. They don't maybe have the same attrition problems. You're not so worried about the dropout rates. You don't worry about people who maybe don't participate fully in all phases of the trial. A lot of people that I work with are talking about people not understanding how they should talk about trials and whether they should share things about their whole life with the people who are staffing the trials. And then on the other side of that, whether it's okay to go out into the world and maybe blog or podcast or Facebook about what happens in a trial. All of that is connected to health literacy and engagement with people in trials all the way through the process. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity that's beyond just the basic, we talked before about informed consent, for example, or return of results summaries. Those are products that are really defined and specific and important. But if you could figure out how to sort of bake this in across the process, I think you would do tremendous good for the people in trials and make a big difference in the outcomes, frankly.
And I'm trying to summarize. I think what you're saying is the two big formats, if you will, are clinical trials and employee engagement, because employee engagement will change how the employees themselves interact, which is awesome. One of the things that no one really talks about, even though I'm starting to see a little bit more in that, is something you hinted at, which is in the marketing world. Do you believe that marketing, by virtue of being direct to consumer in many cases, is generally more health literate than, shall we say, the informed consent forms, which are theoretically supposed to do the same thing?
Sure. I really struggle with the marketing component. In preparation for this podcast, we were talking about this a little bit about around the office, because we want to be careful when we think about how we talk about our work and other people who do work that's similar to ours but not quite the same. But when you're marketing, you're thinking about getting someone's attention and sort of holding it and selling a thing. You're not necessarily always interested in making sure the person understands and it's the right thing.
So what would the right thing look like as you see it?
Well, I think the right thing for a patient, for example, is, a medicine that addresses their condition appropriately, that they feel like is accessible, affordable, and palatable, and lets them get back to living a life that's more close to the life they want to live. For some people, it's a medicine that completely heals, but for others, it's a medicine that maybe makes their condition manageable. But that's a sort of an informed process. And I think about a lot of the people that I know that have chronic health conditions have to take a lot of medicines that don't work very well for them. And they take medicines for their condition and the symptoms of their condition, and then medicines to manage the symptoms of the medicines that they're taking to manage their condition. And it's sort of just mushrooms on people, and they don't always understand what all the connections are. And over time, I think that people can get into situations where because of all the things they have to do or take, they're still not living a better life than they were before. And from my perspective, patients ought to have the information and get to be involved in that decision making about how far down the rabbit hole they go and what that means and what their expectations can and should be. And that's a really informed, active conversation with their healthcare providers, their family caregivers, the patients themselves, depending on their own health condition and age and stage. And that's way more than marketing, right? You see an ad on the TV that says, oh, take this medicine for this, that, or the other condition. And you think, wow, that sounds really great. That person's sort of, running across the field and leaping with the butterflies. And, if I take that medicine, my depression won't feel so bad anymore. And maybe that's true and maybe it's not. But sort of that vision that you see on the screen is not necessarily connected to your own life and your own health and where you are in your stage. So I think it's sort of dangerous to sort of sell these sort of shiny, perfect lives when most of the health conditions we're talking about are really complex, and it's a more sort of deep conversation.
So do you think it makes sense to have these conversations in the context of health literacy more for awareness of disease states as opposed to for describing the product itself? Do you think that from your viewpoint, again, we're not holding you as representing your organization, just sort of in your viewpoint, if you will?
Well, I think it belongs in every place we can fit it, because the fact is, we're already well down the path of marketing about medicines and trials and all of these things. The commercials are going to be there. People are going to see them. People are going to show up at their doctor's office asking about the things that they've seen on the internet or on a TV commercial, or that they've read about in some kind of Twitter conversation or whatever. So not helping to manage that conversation and not thinking about health literacy there is just a mistake, because it's going to happen with or without us. And if we can figure out how to layer communications that actually are helpful to people, I think that they can be better conversations that are more healthy and contribute more to the kind of conversation that we hope that patients are able to have.
Which really takes me in a direction you sort of hinted at a few minutes ago, which was this idea that patients are asking the question of, am I allowed to talk about my disease? Am I allowed to do a podcast on it? Am I allowed to write on this? Do you think a future version of this health literacy process will include companies providing a forum for exactly that to happen? Or do you think that would be, I forget the word for it, is it an anathema or the direct opposite of what these companies would expect?
Well, I think the companies are really grappling with it. We're working with a couple of companies right now who are having these very conversations. And the reality is, if you're in a trial right now, your communication about what's happening in that trial and how you feel, and what you think that means based on whether you got the experimental medicine or some placebo, has pretty significant effects on other people who may be in the trial later. So communication about that is dangerous, and particularly when you can't actually be sure what you have, and one person's experience with the medicine is certainly not reflective of how it's going to behave with another person who may be on a different dose or a different stage in their disease. I mean, there are all of these factors that just means that a person going out and blogging or sharing about their situation is not going to be factually correct for other people. And even if they got it correct in many ways, what we call symptoms, how we talk about it, how we think about the way that certain things feel. Some people think things are unacceptably painful. Other people have a different tolerance for pain. Those words don't have meanings. And so I think companies are trying to figure out what to do to not... People own their information. I'm stumbling a little bit about this because it's really hard to talk about, but the reality is people own their information. They can say whatever they want to say, but what they want to say may not be factually correct and may be hurtful to someone else in a period. And most people, patients who are going out and having these communications, maybe don't have the depth of information or understanding to realize that what they say could be hurtful to someone else. So figuring out how to balance what you're entitled to say because it's your lived experience versus what's helpful for someone else and what's fair and safe is really an important conversation to have, I think. I do think that companies are going to have to figure this out, and they're working really hard to do so. And one way to do that might be, as you reference, having their own sort of, supported platform for some of that conversation for people in trials. But again, because of the regulations that drive so much of trial activity, how you do that in a way that doesn't inappropriately impact the trial and what that means for promotion and all of these other regulatory issues is really quite complex. And so I don't think we'll get there fast. My general reaction is that the companies are going to be pretty conservative about this, and that if they could control information, they would really prefer that people manage what they say really until trials are complete, so that they don't risk damaging the trial and doing something that could be dangerous for another person.
Which really takes us to the question of, not so much a question as much as this. What this tells you is the appropriate times to engage with Catina, to talk to her, to ask HLM how they might be able to help you with that. Catina, we didn't ask you that in the last 2 podcasts, but how does someone reach you, by the way?
Well, we can be reached in all kinds of ways. So we have websites. We have a couple online right now. One is healthliteracy.media. The other is c3t.org. We can be reached by phone. I can be reached by email. You can Google Catina O'Leary, Google healthliteracy.media. You'll get right to us.
Perfect. Before I let you go, Catina, I have one quick thing I wanted to ask you about, which was you talked about how HLM came about because of you trying to address the needs in Missouri. And you sort of then talked a little bit about how you now address global implications. You've had experiences in India, you've had experiences in Taiwan, and you've discovered and sort of explored and explained the differences in needs between men and women. A really short blurb, if you will, on what are some basic factors you find that impede health literacy because of preconceived notions.
So the literature about health literacy tells you that about 9 out of 10 Americans have trouble with health literacy at some point in their life. So that's everybody is sort of struggling. When we struggle the most is when we don't feel well. When we feel sick, we have trouble processing information. We've all had the flu or a cold or something like that, and we can look back and say, oh yeah, I wasn't making the best decisions. But short of that, people that consistently have trouble are people who are younger or older. So when you're younger, you don't have as much experience and you don't know how to make decisions about your health necessarily because you just haven't been exposed. And then older adults have many more health conditions that they're experiencing for the first time, and often that sort of crosses over with some declines in cognition and other things as well. So younger and older. People who have all kinds of other compounding vulnerabilities. So if you think about lack of resources in many communities, those things sort of overlap with health literacy challenges as well and make things harder for people. And just exactly what you would expect. People who have literacy challenges, so more trouble reading and writing, are also people who have problems with health literacy. Much of the information that we give people about healthcare is in written format, so if you have trouble reading, it's really hard to understand those materials as well.
Great. Thank you so much again, Catina. This was amazing. I'd love to have your information so that I can share it with people. And thank you again for joining us. Stay tuned. We hope we can have Dr. O'Leary with us in the future. Would you be interested in coming back on at some point?
Absolutely. It's a great conversation with you.
Thank you again. Take care.
Thank you.
This is the Darshan Talks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.